What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, you read the title, you know what time it is, and I am super pumped to bring this video to you guys. This is our official post-NFL draft, do not draft running back list. If you followed our content for a while, you know that each season, we bring you guys continuous updates, letting you guys know which players are completely off our board and why, and which players we are targeting in all leagues. Considering this is going to be the first do not draft list for the running back position since the NFL draft has now been completed, let this video serve as a jumping off point to our offseason content so we all can be on the same page with which players we're high on and which players we're low on. One thing to keep in mind though is that when it comes to a do not draft list, this is a type of list that is constantly changing. Don't get me wrong though, a lot of the players that we do have listed in this video, either by age or competition for targets or just the offense that they're in, there are specific reasons as to why we're not high on those players. With that said though, the do not draft list is ever changing and we will be touching on this do not draft list throughout the off season. So to be sure that you don't miss out on any of our off season content, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Believe it or not, only 40% of our daily viewers are actually subscribed to the channel. That's right, 60% of the people that watch our videos every day are actually not subscribed. I know it sounds pretty crazy, but if that happens to be one of you guys out there and you support our channel, we'd really appreciate the subscription. And hey, while you're at it, how about giving this video a big thumbs up? And with that, let's get into the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which rookie tight end currently holds the record for most targets in a single season. The correct answer was actually Jeremy Shockey. Congratulations to Matt Bowman, who is the first to get this right on YouTube. And as for Twitter, at KillianM27. As for today's stat of the day, since 2014, how many wide receivers aged 34 plus have had a 1,000 yard receiving season? Once again, that's since 2014, how many wide receivers aged 34 plus have eclipsed the 1,000 yard receiving mark? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, without further ado, let's get into the video, and we do have quite a few players to go over since this is all encompassing our do not draft running back list. And while this is in no particular order, at the top of the list we have none other than Josh Jacobs. Jacobs is definitely a player that we have on this list that's a bit more controversial. Anytime that I have brought him up in previous videos so far this offseason, it seems like the consensus within the community is a bit split. While he has been very productive on the ground since being drafted in the first round a few years ago, he's never really proven to be the type of player to have that top 5 type of upside. This past season, to his credit, he did get pretty darn close, actually finishing as the RB8 in both PPR and standard. But considering that the RB position as a whole was largely unhealthy, and with the added players lost due to COVID regulations, the base level of fantasy points that's required to have a top 12 running back finish was really not as high as we'd become accustomed to in recent years. Regardless though, he was definitely one of the few workhorse running backs in the league, somebody with a guaranteed workload and volume share, and in fantasy football, that's something that's very valuable. Week in and week out, there are many factors that do impact what actual results we see on the field. Largely efficiency, touchdown variance play major roles in the production, and while many of those factors are unpredictable and out of our hands, the one thing we really can guarantee week over week comes down to running back volume. To Josh Jacobs' credit, volume is definitely something we had become accustomed to with him, making him the ideal type of running back you'd want to start in your RB2 slot, somebody that can give you that safe and consistent production, leaving your high-end RB1 to take you over the top. Anybody that did own Josh Jacobs and utilized him for that specific role was definitely rewarded, and likely has very fond memories of how Josh Jacobs performed for the 2020 season. In retrospect, looking back at 2020, there were some red flags that were oftentimes overlooked, and now heading into 2021, there's even more risk factors, potentially taking away that safe floor that we had become accustomed accustomed to with Josh Jacobs, ultimately this rendered his ADP to drop significantly, and we have had no choice but to add him to our do not draft list. Before we do get into the elephant in the room, that's the competition for touches with Kenyon Drake now on the roster, let's talk a bit about the things that are overlooked about him. For starters, Josh Jacobs, although he's a first round talent, he's not really the most athletically gifted. He's not the type of player that you're going to see break off these massive runs like a player like Saquon Barkley. This does render him to a player that is going to be more volume based in order to reach his production goals. On top of that, the efficiency, while it was very impeccable in his rookie season, even averaging nearly 4.8 yards per carry on the ground, 242 carries resulted in 1,150 rushing yards. Compare that to the drop-off he had in efficiency in his sophomore season, presumably more healthy, playing in more games. This was a player who received 30 plus more touches on the ground, yet ran for nearly 100 less rushing yards, failing to eclipse 4 rushing yards per carry. Not all his efficiency can be thrown on his shoulders. Of course, a lot of it has to do with the offensive line, but are we expecting this offensive line to take massive strides forward for this upcoming season? It's really not something we can guarantee at this point. Another factor about Josh Jacobs commonly overlooked is his lack of work in the receiving game, with most leagues in 2021 being some form of PPR or half PPR. You're going to find it really difficult for running backs to start to make it inside the top 12 or even push for that top 5 production without getting any work in the receiving game. Derrick Henry would be the lone outlier in that area. You could throw Nick Chubb's name in there as well in the back half of the RB1s, but when it comes to Josh Jacobs, he really just doesn't seem like the type of player who's going to be able to get it done just on the ground alone. Unlike Tennessee, unlike Cleveland, this isn't the type of offense that's going to be putting up massive point totals. It's also not the type of team to have leads late in games, ultimately leading to more production on the ground in the third and fourth quarters, making Josh Jacobs a very susceptible player to game script. In 2 pro seasons, he has now combined for a total of 53 receptions. The efficiency on those receptions hasn't been great either, also indicating to us that we really shouldn't expect an uptick in that area, especially with Kenyon Drake now on the roster. And speaking of Drake, while no, I'm not exactly high on Kenyon Drake to begin with, I'm also not going to be targeting Kenyon Drake in drafts. A lot of the concerns I have with Josh Jacobs, you can translate them over to Kenyon Drake just due to being on the same offense, behind the same offensive line. But one thing that we do know for sure is that Kenyon Drake, when compared to Josh Jacobs, is going to be the primary pass catching running back in this offense. That's going to lead to less snaps for Josh Jacobs. The one thing that he really had going for him was that consistent volume. And although I'm not concerned with him losing a massive amount of work in the receiving game because it's not something he really ever had, less time on the field, less third down opportunities, and the way Kenyon Drake did perform in the red zone last season, I wouldn't be surprised for him to compete in that area of the field as well. All in all, this adds up to Josh Jacobs having the appearance of being a draft day value, especially after finishing inside the top 10 for 2020, now being drafted nearly 10 spots lower than where he finished. And while many people take that as a sign to draft Josh Jacobs in any opportunity they can, we've made sure to add him to our do not draft list for 2021. Alright guys, we're moving on to the next running back on our do not draft list. It's Melvin Gordon of the Denver Broncos. Now I am going to gloss over this one a bit quicker than that of Josh Jacobs, just because I did mention Javonte Williams in our must-own rookie video that I just posted last week. If you click on the top right of your screen, you can get linked to that video, so if you haven't checked it out, definitely do so. It goes a bit in depth onto why I like this Denver Broncos offense a lot more heading into 2021, and a large portion of that has to do with the sheer amount of highly talented weapons that are in this offense. Looking at just the receiver position, you have Jerry Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, who's returning from injury. You also have underrated players like KJ Hamler and Tim Patrick, each of which in their own right stepped up throughout the 2020 season with lackluster quarterback play. And not to mention Noah Fant, one of these superstars in this offense at a position that typically takes a few years to fully develop. Noah Fant now heading into his 3rd season as a pro. I wouldn't be surprised for him to compete for one of his best seasons in the NFL. And with the addition of Teddy Bridgewater now to compete with Drew Lock for starting duties, it just provides a second option in this offense. So if Drew Lock just isn't stepping up, or Teddy Bridgewater is just straight up the better option, we know this team is going to be putting their best foot forward on Sundays. So with all of that being said, why am I very high on the Denver Broncos offense, yet Melvin Gordon is making this do not draft list? And a large part of that has to do with the high draft capital invested in a running back, Javonte Williams. One thing we all know is that draft capital is king, especially at the running back position. So whenever a team is investing that type of capital into an early rusher, history has shown us that they are going to get some usage. Barring injury, we can expect Javonte Williams to be competing with touches with Melvin Gordon, quite possibly a 1A, 1B type situation, which when compared to the 2020 season is a little bit less of an opportunity share than Melvin Gordon was already gaining. In 2020, Melvin Gordon appeared in 15 games, received 247 touches, totaling 1,044 yards to go along with 10 touchdowns. That was good for an RB14 finish, which is pretty respectable for a free agent running back on a new offense. Unfortunately for Gordon though, the end of season stats doesn't really paint the actual picture for what it was like to own Melvin Gordon. Despite appearing in 15 games, he was only able to eclipse double-digit fantasy points in 10 starts, and only in 3 games was he able to eclipse 20 fantasy points, meaning the majority of the time that you started him, you were likely disappointed with the production. Now with the offense headed towards a shakeup with potentially a new quarterback, Broncos showing no commitment to Drew Lock, what's to tell you that they're going to commit to Melvin Gordon, especially when they invested second-round draft capital into Williams? Considering the draft day price tag to nab Melvin Gordon in fantasy drafts is the RB23, Javonte Williams were getting 15 spots later as a late-round running back selection. If there is any chance, and I believe a very likely chance, that they will be splitting carries, I'm going to opt to take the discount on a running back that's unproven when we've seen a lot of what Melvin Gordon brings to the table. Like I had mentioned though, I did recently bring up Javonte Williams in last video, so if you haven't checked out the must-own rookies, definitely do so today. We're going to move on though, and before we get into the next player, just a quick shout out that if you want to follow along and stay up to date on all of our targets, all of our players to avoid, consider signing up for our draft package at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Literally nothing can beat just having the website open as we go through these videos so you can follow along and really understand our draft process. We've simplified things while also adding information, so all of the content is extremely easy to digest. And of course, we're famous for having everything just backed by the numbers. If that sounds like something that interests you, once again, that's at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link as always in the description box below. The next player we have, you had to see coming. It's none other than David Johnson of the Houston Texans. Currently, David Johnson's coming off of a season in which he played 12 games, finished as the RB21 in PPR scoring settings, but very similarly to the other running backs we've listed in this video, the end of season finish really doesn't paint the picture of what it was like to own him. Although David Johnson is a running back most famously known for his receiving skill set, and inherently those types of players do come with a higher floor, it does make reaching the ceiling for those types of players a bit easier. David Johnson, unfortunately though, was a player that never really reached his ceiling. In the first half of the season, he was completely healthy, receiving double-digit touches in each and every game. Unfortunately, never quite eclipsing 20 fantasy points in a single game, being more of a steady Eddie type of player, looking slow, despite actually playing pretty efficiently. He ultimately ended the season with a 4.7 yards per carry average, which if we were chasing stat lines would look pretty enticing, but we cannot forget this was still a player who was only able to eclipse 65 rushing yards in a mere 4 of 12 games. If you were to tell me that Deshaun Watson was going to return to Houston, the Texans would also be returning with the combination of both Brandon Cooks and Will Fuller, I would be a bit higher on this offense. But no matter which way you look at it, the Houston Texans offense is likely going to be one of the offenses taking the biggest dip south. Whenever an offense is losing an elite quarterback like Deshaun Watson is, albeit he is a rushing quarterback, a mobile quarterback, which historically has had difficulty supporting high-end running backs, I do think in David Johnson's first year with Deshaun Watson, there was enough promise to possibly take a shot on him depending on where he fell in drafts, but that's not the case at all. Deshaun Watson, he's not returning. Will Fuller, also not returning, leaving Brandon Cooks, a wide receiver who's a mere 1 concussion away from missing several games this season. It's really difficult to project this offense to have much success for 2021. Whenever we're targeting running backs in in fantasy drafts, we always want to target running backs on strong offenses with powerful defenses, teams that can have leads in the mid game, in the late game, to help promote additional rushing volume in all four quarters. That's something we simply won't have with David Johnson for 2021, and while a bit of that will be offset with his work in the receiving game, whenever David Johnson is asked to do a bit too much, it just seems like his body can't hold up. It's crazy to think that when looking at David Johnson, you see an old player. This is still a guy who's basically my same age here, and from week 9 on, David Johnson only appeared in just 5 games, 3 of those 5 games coming in weeks 15, 16, and 17. If you just so happen to make the playoffs, guarantee David Johnson was not the reason, nor could you actually trust him when it mattered most, and believe it or not, 3 of his best fantasy performances actually came through that span. Anybody who owned David Johnson and started him with playoff aspirations to start the season, odds are they were unlikely to meet that goal. David Johnson, while he was an RB2 in fantasy drafts for the 2020 season, you really couldn't count on him as anything more than a flex. Now heading into 2021, you're talking about an offense and a team as a whole that's in shambles. David Johnson on a 1-year contract. Who's to say exactly where he goes next or if he possibly retires? But the one thing that we do know is for sure is that David Johnson's health is very questionable, as well as the amount of gas he has left in the tank. Even with all these glaring issues though, we do have him ranked where we feel is extremely fair in that flex territory. So if you are somebody who does not take our advice and drafts David Johnson, or maybe he falls to a point in the draft where you just think the value exceeds any price tag that comes along with it, our ranking just outside the top 30 we feel is more than fair. And when it comes to ADP, David Johnson is a high-end RB3 just inside the top 30, so not a massive gap in discrepancy there. Typically when we are in that draft range based on mock drafts, we have opted for players with higher upside or opted to draft a player at a different position to try to gain an advantage there, because the upside or depth that we gain from David Johnson really cannot be relied upon. Moving into the next player, we have another familiar name on our do not draft list. It's Devin Singletary of the Buffalo Bills. When it comes to Devin Singletary, the formula for him is pretty simple. We already have a pretty good sample size of what we can expect from Devin Singletary, both in this offense as well as with different running backs competing for touches in this backfield. One of the main factors limiting the potential upside for Devin Singletary definitely comes down to Josh Allen being the quarterback of this offense. Now, Josh Allen alone is a really good, strong offensive quarterback, but we have many years of past history to reflect upon. When it comes to big mobile quarterbacks in the red zone, it just provides the offense another avenue to score the football on the ground that doesn't involve the running back position. Josh Allen over the past 3 seasons has had 8, 9, and 8 rushing touchdowns, which when compared to lesser mobile quarterbacks or pure pocket passing quarterbacks, those touchdowns that were rushed in by Josh Allen would typically go to other running backs in the backfield, whereas in the Buffalo offense, those opportunities just simply aren't going around. In addition to that, Devin Singletary is competing for touches as well as red zone touches with Zach Moss, who has a significant size advantage. Devin Singletary in his rookie season without Zach Moss rushed for 2 touchdowns, followed that up in his sophomore season with Zach Moss with another 2 rushing touchdowns. That brings his career total to 4 rushing touchdowns, a mark that we can't see significantly increasing so long as Josh Allen is the quarterback and Zach Moss is still there competing for touches. Moss in just his first 5 starts already compiled 3 rushing touchdowns, a mark that already surpassed 2 seasons of production for Devin Singletary. And while that's not a death sentence on his overall value, we've seen many running backs have value through the passing game, we do have to understand that Zach Moss is no slouch in that area either. Week 1, Zach Moss right out of the gate received 4 targets, converting 3 of those into receptions, even catching a touchdown through the air, a feat despite Devin Singletary playing in all 16 games was unable to accomplish throughout the entire season. That was on the back of 50 targets. And as for his outlook for the 2021 season, we really can't expect a massive uptick in volume. Zach Moss is going to be returning and presumably more healthy. Even with Devin Singletary splitting carries with both Zach Moss and Frank Gore in his rookie season, the workload for Devin Singletary has remained pretty consistent across both seasons. His rookie season receiving 151 carries on the ground as opposed to 156 in 2020, and his 41 targets he received in his rookie season did get a slight uptick to 50, but once again that was because Zach Moss did miss 3 games, which is likely to have contributed to the uptick in production. With that said though, we can't discredit the fact that Zach Moss has been injury riddled throughout both college and his NFL career. If ultimately Devin Singletary is the only man in town, then he will get the volume, but we cannot forget this is still an undersized back who has a pretty limited skill set. He's not going to break any tackles. For a change of pace back, he's not really the fastest. He's also not really the shiftiest. He certainly can get the job done if need be, and he has been overall efficient throughout his career. But at 5'7", 203 pounds, it's just an unfair assumption to expect him to receive a workhorse type of role. I will admit that the ADP for Devin Singletary when compared to last season definitely settled to where it should be. In 2020, Devin Singletary was being drafted as an RB2. This time around, he's more of a flex/bench player, which definitely fits his skill set and usage. But when it comes to players we're typically targeting in the middle to later rounds, we're looking for running backs that have that upside to be top 20 guys. When it comes to Devin Singletary, just on this offense where touchdowns are being vultured, and Zach Moss, if healthy, is always going to be chipping into his workload. Zach Moss, if injured, we already know that Devin Singletary's skill set does limit him as well. There's just a few boxes that we like to check at the running back position in the middle or later rounds that Devin Singletary just doesn't quite hit. Alright guys, I know this video is getting long, but we do have one more player, or let's say one more backfield that we want to add. You could consider this an honorable mention, but it's none other than the San Francisco 49ers backfield, a la Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson Jr. At first, I wasn't sure if we should really be including these players because I didn't know a lot of people were heavily targeting these players, but after looking at ADP across multiple platforms, I realized a lot of people are really big fans of Raheem Mostert. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand that the offense of the San Francisco 49ers, it's a desirable one for fantasy. They've been one of the most productive ground rushing units for several years, even prior to Kyle Shanahan, so the history of success for running backs in this offense, it's definitely there. Raheem Mostert himself is also no stranger to highlight plays, and whenever you have players that are making ESPN highlights or NFL Network highlights, you know right away that their draft stock is going to rise. On the flip side, we see oftentimes that whenever running backs burn fantasy owners who invested draft capital into them the year before, the adverse effect is that their draft stock does decline. When it comes to Raheem Mostert, I really don't see his draft stock falling from where it should be after burning fantasy owners, and not to mention that the San Francisco 49ers invested third-round draft capital into a running back to add to this committee, and if you didn't notice, the key word there that I used is committee. The San Francisco 49ers have given us no indication that they're going to just lean on a workhorse running back. They've also given us no indication that that is guaranteed to be Raheem Mostert, but you almost wouldn't suspect that when looking at his ADP, which is currently the RB26. That right there completely blows my mind, especially considering Raheem Mostert is one of those running backs that's not going to be heavily utilized in the receiving game. Then factor in his health concerns. Last season, he only appeared in 8 games. 2 seasons before that, he only appeared in 9 games. And once again, this is a 29-year-old running back. We already mentioned earlier in this video how David Johnson, 29 himself, does have the moniker of being an old back, and I believe because Raheem Mostert hasn't really been a household name for many years, people just assume that he is a relatively younger player. That assumption would be dead wrong. He's actually been in the league since all the way back in 2014, which does make you have to wonder exactly what took him so long to get his opportunity. The running back position, like most positions in the NFL, has a strong correlation with breakout age. Very few times do we see running backs that break out in their mid to late 20s actually have lengthy careers after their breakout. The most recent example I can remember of a player that fit that type of mold to be fantasy relevant for 1 to 2 years was Justin Forsett, who, as we all know, he did fall off a cliff immediately after his really big season. And Raheem Mostert, while he is getting a ton of hype, he is on a strong rushing offense. defense, a strong offense as a whole with one of the greatest coaching minds in the NFL. Can we even say for certain that he is actually broken out? Excluding the 2019 season in which he played a full 16 games, he was still unable to eclipse 1,000 total yards, failed to crack the top 24 in PPR leagues, and sandwiched that year in with 2 injury-riddled seasons. Now you're all of a sudden expecting me to pay an RB2 type price tag for Raheem Mostert, a player that for some reason has a bit more name value than I'd like to admit. I believe if you poll 10 random fantasy strangers, 2 to 3 of them are going to admit that Raheem Mostert is going to be a player that they're targeting on draft day. I'm hoping that after this video, you can cross him off your list. If Raheem Mostert, the 30-year-old breakout, somehow exceeds my expectations and proves me wrong, I'm going to be completely fine with it. Good for him. He does have all the tools in the offense to do it, but I'll tell you one thing for sure, I'm not losing any sleep over it because there are just so many other running backs I'd rather target inside the top 30, and that's exactly where he's going in fantasy drafts. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. Don't forget, only 40% of you guys actually subscribed. If you did gain anything from this video, please consider subscribing today. If you did enjoy the video, please hit that like button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.